The conventional wisdom about Argentina's economy was that it's completely broken. Inflation topped 2,000%. It's defaulted on its debt more than any nation on earth, and a dollar worth in their currency went from looking like this to this. That was until one man, Javier Milei, took a literal and metaphorical chainsaw to the country, and against the odds, it seemed to work, right up until the moment it didn't.
To the Trump administration finalizing a $20 billion Argentina bailout.
Support for him is flagging.
Javier Milei is meeting Donald Trump in Washington today, just days after the U.S. agreed to provide him with a $20 billion economic lifeline.
This has now led everyone back to the same conclusion. It's still completely broken. There's a saying amongst economists that there are basically three kinds of countries: rich ones, poor ones, and Argentina. At this point, the nation seems to have tried every form of government, from hardline socialism all the way to anarcho-capitalism. But no matter what it tries, it seems to end up in the exact same place: a brief boom followed by a crisis and eventually collapse. With the recent landslide in the Senate elections, many people are predicting that Javier Milei might finally be the man to break the country out this doom loop. But while on the surface it was a great victory, the truth is that the future of the nation is now more unstable than ever, and whether they're able to succeed has much less to do with economics and a lot more to do with a strange legacy that still haunts the country to this day. Argentina hasn't always been like this. In fact, it used to be one of the richest countries globally. In the 1920s, its GDP per capita was amongst the top 10 in the world, roughly on par with places like France and Italy, and its capital, Buenos Aires, was often called the Paris of South America. Since then, many countries which have started poorer have sprinted past, and from the 1950s onwards, places like Japan, Hong Kong, and South Korea pulled off the same playbook: attract reliable foreign capital, build a competitive manufacturing base, and sell into already rich markets. That formula demands one thing above all else: stability. Investors have to believe that the rules today will hold for tomorrow. That stability is something which can take decades to develop and just one bad government to ruin. And for Argentina, that's exactly what proceeded to happen. Even though they were relatively rich, they had one of the highest levels of inequality in the developed world. A tiny elite of landowners controlled almost all of Argentina's vast agricultural wealth, while millions of urban workers lived in poverty, crammed into slums on the edges of Buenos Aires. So in 1946, a man named Juan Perón was infamously elected on a promise to change. In theory, that might not sound like such a bad thing, but this decision has gone on to haunt Argentina every year since. The problem was, once he'd agreed to do some redistribution, it became very difficult to know who to actually give money to. Suddenly, everyone had their hands out: farmers demanding subsidies, public sector unions asking for pay rises, and businesses lobbying for emergency relief to protect jobs that didn't really exist. The government found itself in a position where the only way to keep everybody happy was to make everything cheaper. As impossible as that might sound, the government did actually have a weird way of doing this, at least for a little while. Imagine that under normal circumstances, $1 is worth 100 Argentine pesos. If the government suddenly doubles the value of the peso so that 100 pesos is now worth $2, then overnight, Argentines can technically buy twice as much from abroad for the same price. This is exactly what they did, and for a few years, this artificial increase in the value of the peso created what many remember as a golden age, something that lives on in the nation's memory today. But as the saying goes, if it sounds too good to be true, that's because it probably is. While the cheap exchange rate allowed Argentinian consumers to buy a ton of stuff on the cheap, it had the opposite impact on the country's producers. Because the currency was so expensive, nobody outside of Argentina wanted to buy the things the country was making. This made it impossible to develop any real forms of industry, simply because there wasn't any market to sell their products. It's a classic trap that developing countries fall into, trying to raise living standards too quickly by keeping their currency artificially strong. Usually countries continue on this self-destructive path for decades. But this is where things start to look a bit strange for Argentina in particular, because it's not like governments since the 50s haven't tried to do things differently. The military juntas in the 70s, the Menem government of the 90s, and even the brief technocratic governments of the 2000s all tried to transform Argentina into an export-led manufacturing economy, but they each ran into the same problem. Whenever they tried to bring the currency down in value, it sparked a round of inflation, crushing their popularity, and eventually they'd get booted out of office by the very Peronists who had gotten them into this mess. This cycle has become so common that it's got its own name, KUKA risk, and it explains why the country has found it so hard to get off the ground. Whenever a sound government gets into power, investors note that it's basically only a matter of time before they get kicked out by socialist Peronists, so they avoid spending any real money on long-term projects